Black 8-year-old saves neighborhood with a garden. The bulldozers rumbled forward, their metal tracks crushing the wildflowers that had somehow managed to grow in the vacant lot. 8-year-old Marcus Johnson stood firm, his small frame seemingly no match for the massive yellow machines. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and tears streamed down his dark cheeks. Behind him, dozens of neighbors formed a human chain around what remained of the community garden. Old Mrs. Patterson with her walker, Mr. Washington still in his postal uniform, and even stern Principal Hayes. "You can't take our garden," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking. "People need this food. My grandma needs her medicine plants." The construction foreman stepped forward, waving a sheaf of papers. "Kid, I'm sorry, but this lot has been sold. The development starts today. Now please move before someone gets hurt." At that moment, a black Mercedes pulled up, and a tall man in an expensive suit emerged. Marcus recognized him immediately from the newspaper clippings his grandmother kept, Mr. Albert Coleman, the wealthy developer who had been buying up properties throughout their struggling neighborhood. The man who had promised to revitalize the area with luxury apartments no one who lived here could afford. Coleman looked at the crowd, at the garden with its carefully tended rows of vegetables and herbs, and then at Marcus. For a moment, something flickered across his face, recognition, perhaps, or memory. Then his expression hardened. "Clear them out," he ordered the foreman. The bulldozer inched forward again. Marcus didn't move. Behind him, his grandmother Gloria called out in fear, "But let's go back to how this all started." It was just 3 hours earlier when Marcus was walking home from school, taking the long way as he always did. Marcus kicked an empty soda can down the cracked sidewalk of Maple Street. His backpack, heavy with books, pulled at his thin shoulders. It was a warm spring day in 1979, and all around him, the Washington Heights neighborhood of Chicago showed signs of neglect: boarded-up storefronts, apartment buildings with broken windows, and far too many "for sale" signs. Still, Marcus loved this neighborhood. He knew every corner, every shortcut, and most importantly, every person. He waved to Mr. Washington, who was delivering mail in his crisp blue uniform. "Afternoon, young man," Mr. Washington called. "How was school today?" "It was okay," Marcus replied. "We're learning about plants and how they grow. The teacher says plants can grow almost anywhere if they get what they need." "Is that so?" Mr. Washington smiled, adjusting his mail bag. "Well, you're certainly growing like a weed yourself. Tell your grandma I said hello." Marcus nodded and continued his journey, passing Mrs. Patterson's house with its immaculate front yard, the only one on the block with flowers. The elderly woman was outside, carefully tending to her roses despite her arthritic hands. "Hello, Mrs. Patterson," Marcus called. The old woman looked up, her face breaking into a smile that erased some of the deep lines etched by time and hardship. "Marcus Johnson, just the young man I wanted to see. Come help an old lady with these stubborn weeds, will you?" Marcus set down his backpack and knelt beside her in the soft dirt. Mrs. Patterson had been a teacher for 40 years before retiring, and she never stopped teaching. As they worked, she pointed out different plants and explained their names and purposes. "You know," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "during the Depression, folks around here grew victory gardens. Food was scarce then, like it's getting to be now with the plant closings, but people took care of each other." Marcus nodded, thinking about the empty refrigerator at home. His grandmother Gloria worked 2 jobs, but since his grandfather had passed away last year, things had been tight. "My grandma says things are changing," Marcus said, carefully pulling a weed from around a rose bush. "She says rich people are going to come and push us all out." Mrs. Patterson's hands stilled. "Gentrification, they call it. Been happening all over. But this is our home, Marcus. Sometimes you have to plant your feet and grow where you are." After helping Mrs. Patterson, Marcus continued toward home, but he took a detour past the large vacant lot on Cedar Street. Once home to a factory that had employed half the neighborhood, the lot had sat empty for years after the factory closed and moved operations overseas. Now it was just a patch of dirt and rubble with a few stubborn wildflowers pushing through the cracks. Marcus stopped and looked at the empty space. His teacher's words echoed in his mind. "Plants can grow almost anywhere if they get what they need." What if? The idea hit him like a bolt of lightning. What if they could turn this empty lot into a garden, a place where people could grow food for the neighborhood? His grandmother Gloria knew all about plants. She was always talking about the garden her family had when she was growing up in Mississippi. Excited now, Marcus ran the rest of the way home to the small apartment he shared with his grandmother. When he burst through the door, he found Gloria Johnson sitting at the kitchen table, a pile of bills before her and a worried expression on her face. Gloria looked up, quickly tucking the bills into an envelope. At 65, she still stood straight and proud despite the arthritis that plagued her hands. Her hair, once black as midnight, was now shot through with silver, and her face showed the lines of a life lived with both joy and struggle. "Child, what's got you running like the wind?" she asked, forcing a smile. "Grandma, I have the best idea," Marcus exclaimed, dropping his backpack and sliding into the chair across from her. "We could make a garden in that big empty lot on Cedar Street. Mrs. Patterson was telling me about Victory Gardens, and my teacher says plants can grow anywhere, and we could grow food and maybe even those herbs you're always saying could help your arthritis but cost too much at the store." Gloria's expression softened as she listened to her grandson's excited chatter. When he finally paused for breath, she reached across the table and took his small hand in her weathered one. "That's a wonderful thought, baby. But that lot belongs to someone, and people like us don't get to just take over property, even if it's sitting empty." "But it's just sitting there," Marcus protested. "Nobody's using it, and you always say God didn't make the earth for it to be empty." Gloria looked at her grandson thoughtfully. So much like his father, her son who had died in Vietnam before Marcus was even born. The same determined set to his jaw, the same belief that the world could be better if only people tried. "Tell you what," she said finally. "Let me make some calls. I know a few people at City Hall from my days working there. Maybe we can find out who owns that lot and if there's a way to use it properly." Marcus beamed. When Grandma Gloria set her mind to something, things happened. The next day after school, Marcus sat at the kitchen table doing his homework when Gloria returned from her job as a hospital cafeteria worker. She hung up her coat carefully and sat down across from him, a mixture of excitement and caution on her face. "I talked to my friend Evelyn, who works at the records office," she said. "That lot is owned by the city now after the factory went bankrupt, and there's something called a community garden permit we could apply for. It wouldn't give us ownership, but it would give us legal permission to garden there until the city decides to do something else with it." Marcus jumped up, unable to contain his excitement. "Can we apply, please, Grandma?" Gloria nodded slowly. "We can try, but it'll take work, Marcus, lots of work, and we'll need help." "I'll help, and I bet Mrs. Patterson would too, and maybe Mr. Washington, and slow down," Gloria laughed, the sound warming their small kitchen. "First, we need to get the permit, then we need to make a plan. Good things take time and care to grow, just like people do." Over the next few weeks, Gloria and Marcus worked on their application for the community garden permit. They gathered signatures from neighbors, created a simple plan for how the garden would be organized, and even got Principal Hayes from Marcus's school to write a letter of support, suggesting the garden could be an educational opportunity for students. On a sunny Saturday morning in April, Gloria received an official letter from the city. She called Marcus in from where he was playing checkers with the Rodriguez twins from the apartment next door. "It came," she said, holding up the envelope with shaking hands. Marcus rushed to her side. "Open it, Grandma, open it." Gloria carefully slit the envelope and pulled out the letter. As she read, her expression shifted from tension to joy. "We got it," she whispered. "We got the permit." The celebration that followed was small but heartfelt. Gloria made her special lemonade, the kind with real lemons and just the right amount of sugar, and they sat on their tiny balcony planning the garden. "We should grow tomatoes," Marcus said, "and corn like in your stories about Mississippi. And collard greens and okra," Gloria added. "And herbs rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, lavender to help people sleep." The next day, they began spreading the word throughout the neighborhood. Some people were skeptical. Why put effort into something temporary? But others caught their enthusiasm. Mrs. Patterson volunteered her knowledge of flowers and donated seeds. Mr. Washington promised to help with the heavy digging on his days off. Even gruff Mr. Lopez, who owned the corner bodega and rarely spoke to anyone, offered to save vegetable crates that could be repurposed as planters. By the end of the week, they had a small but dedicated group ready to transform the vacant lot. On Saturday morning, they gathered with tools, donated seeds, and determination. The work was harder than Marcus had imagined. The ground was compacted and littered with debris from the old factory, broken glass, rusty metal, and chunks of concrete. But the volunteers worked steadily, clearing a section at a time. Gloria supervised, directing people with the natural authority she had developed raising 3 children on her own after her husband died. As they worked, more neighbors stopped by. Some just watched, but others picked up tools and joined in. By mid-afternoon, they had cleared a significant portion of the lot. "Look, Grandma," Marcus called, pointing to a corner they had cleared and filled with compost donated by the city's garden program. "It's already starting to look like a garden," Gloria smiled, wiping sweat from her brow. "It's a beginning, child, just a beginning." Over the next several weeks, the garden took shape. They divided it into sections, vegetables in the sunniest spots, herbs along the edges, and flowers scattered throughout to attract bees and butterflies. They used discarded tires as planters, painted bright colors by the neighborhood children. Old wooden pallets became raised beds, and someone donated a rain barrel to collect water. The garden became a gathering place. People who had lived next door to each other for years but barely spoken now worked side by side, exchanging stories and advice. Marcus soaked it all in, learning from everyone how to tell when the soil was ready for planting, how deep to set each seed, how to watch for pests without using chemicals they couldn't afford. Gloria's herbs flourished under her careful attention. She shared her knowledge freely, teaching others which plants could help with common ailments. "My grandmother taught me," she explained to a young mother struggling with a colicky baby. And her grandmother taught her, all the way back to when our people weren't allowed doctors. As spring warmed into summer, the first vegetables appeared: radishes and lettuce, quick to mature. The day they harvested enough to share with several families was a neighborhood celebration. Children ran through sprinklers set up to water the plants. Adults shared dishes made with the garden's bounty, and for a few hours the struggles of their daily lives receded. Marcus watched it all with pride. This was his idea, his garden, but more than that, it was becoming the heart of the neighborhood. Then on a hot July morning, everything changed. Marcus was at the garden early, watering the tomato plants before the day's heat set in. Gloria had the early shift at the hospital, so he was alone, enjoying the peaceful moments before the neighborhood woke fully. A black Mercedes pulled up alongside the garden, looking out of place on the potholed street. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped out, surveying the garden with an unreadable expression. Marcus watched cautiously. Strangers in nice cars were rarely good news in this neighborhood. The man approached, his polished shoes incongruous among the garden rows. "Good morning," he said. "Is this your garden?" Marcus stood straighter. "It's the neighborhood's garden. We have a permit." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Albert Coleman. I own Coleman Development Corporation." "Do you know what that is?" Marcus shook his head. "We build things, nice things, and we're interested in this property." "But we have a permit," Marcus repeated. "The city said we could have our garden here." Coleman's smile tightened. "Permits are temporary, son. Progress is permanent. You tell the adults in charge of this project that Albert Coleman stopped by. I'll be in touch." He handed Marcus a business card, then returned to his car and drove away. Marcus stared after him, a sick feeling in his stomach. When Gloria returned from work, Marcus told her about the visitor. Her face darkened as he described the man and repeated his words. "Albert Coleman," she murmured, sitting heavily at the kitchen table. "I've heard that name. He's been buying up property all over the South Side. But he can't take our garden, right, Grandma? We have a permit." Gloria didn't answer immediately. "Let me make some calls," she said finally. The next day, Gloria gathered several of the garden's most dedicated volunteers in their small apartment. Mrs. Patterson was there, along with Mr. Washington, Principal Hayes, and a few others. "I spoke with my friend at City Hall," Gloria said, her voice grave. "Coleman Development has put in a bid to buy several blocks in the neighborhood, including our lot. They're planning luxury apartments, upscale shops, the kind of places none of us could afford." "But what about our permit?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "It's only good until the city decides to sell or develop the land," Gloria explained, "and the city council is voting next week on Coleman's proposal." A heavy silence fell over the room. "So that's it?" Mr. Washington asked. "They just take our garden just like that?" "Not if we fight," Gloria said firmly. "We have rights as residents. We can attend the council meeting, speak out." "Will they listen?" Principal Hayes asked skeptically. "Money talks louder than people these days." "Maybe," Gloria acknowledged. "But if we don't try, we've already lost." They spent the rest of the evening making plans: who would speak at the meeting, what points to emphasize, how to get more neighbors involved. Marcus listened intently, taking mental notes. As everyone was leaving, he tugged at Principal Hayes' sleeve. "Can I speak at the meeting too?" he asked. The principal looked down at him thoughtfully. "It's unusual for someone your age, Marcus." "But this garden was your idea, wasn't it?" Marcus nodded solemnly. "Then maybe you should. Sometimes adults need to be reminded of what's important by those who see things clearly." The day of the city council meeting arrived. The small council chamber was packed with people from the neighborhood, many of whom had never attended a civic meeting before. Gloria had helped them dress their best. "They judge by appearances," she had said, pressing Marcus's only button-up shirt the night before. When it came time for public comments on Coleman's proposal, Gloria spoke first, her voice steady and dignified as she described what the garden meant to the community. Others followed. Mrs. Patterson spoke of the healing power of growing things. Mr. Washington emphasized the way the garden had brought people together, and Principal Hayes outlined the educational benefits for neighborhood children. Finally, it was Marcus's turn. He stood, small but determined, facing the council members seated on their raised platform. "My name is Marcus Johnson," he began, his voice only slightly trembling. "I'm 8 years old, and the community garden was my idea." He described how the garden had started, how it was feeding people and teaching children, how neighbors who had never spoken now shared meals. "Before the garden, that lot was just trash and broken glass," he said. "Now it's life. Please don't take that away from us." The council members nodded politely, but Marcus could see some of them glancing at their watches. As he returned to his seat, Albert Coleman rose to speak. Coleman was smooth and persuasive, talking of jobs and economic opportunity, of revitalization and progress. He promised a few affordable units in his luxury development, promised construction jobs, promised a new future for the neighborhood. "Change is inevitable," he concluded. "The question is whether you want managed, profitable change or continuing decay." The council voted 7-2 to approve Coleman's proposal. Outside the chamber, the garden supporters gathered, stunned and angry. "So that's it," Mr. Washington demanded. "They can just ignore everything we said." "We knew it was a long shot," Gloria said quietly, though her eyes showed her disappointment. "But we had to try." Marcus looked around at the defeated faces. "What do we do now?" Gloria put her arm around his shoulders. "We keep going as long as we can. The sale isn't final yet. There are papers to sign, permits to approve. We have our garden for a little while longer." The group dispersed, heading back to their neighborhood with heavy hearts. But as they walked, Gloria began to formulate a plan. She had lived through too much the civil rights struggles, Vietnam taking her son, the economic collapse of her neighborhood, to give up easily. Over the next few days, Gloria made more calls, researched city ordinances, and consulted with a legal aid attorney. Meanwhile, the garden continued. If anything, more people joined in, drawn by the news that their green oasis was threatened. A week after the council vote, Gloria called another meeting, this time in the garden itself. She waited until everyone had gathered, the evening sun casting long shadows across the thriving plants. "I've learned something important," she announced. "The sale may have been approved, but Coleman Development still needs to complete environmental and historical assessments before breaking ground. That could take months." "So we have time?" Mrs. Patterson asked hopefully. "Time, yes," Gloria nodded. "And something else. I found an old city ordinance that says if a structure or site has significant cultural or historical value to a neighborhood, it can be considered for protected status." "But the garden's only a few months old," Mr. Washington pointed out. "The garden is," Gloria agreed, "but not the land it sits on. This was the site of the Maple Street factory where many of our parents and grandparents worked. It was also a meeting place during the labor movements of the 1930s. Understanding dawned on the faces around her. "You're saying we could apply for historical status for the site?" Principal Hayes asked. "Exactly," Gloria confirmed. "It's a long shot, but possible. And in the meantime, we need to make our garden so important to this community that no one would dare tear it down." They brainstormed ideas expanding the garden, hosting community events, inviting school groups, documenting everything with photos and stories. Marcus suggested they create a garden newspaper to share updates and gardening tips. As summer progressed, the garden flourished, both literally and as a community center. They held harvest dinners where neighbors shared dishes made from the garden's produce. Gloria and other elders taught classes on canning and preserving food for the winter. Marcus and his friends gave tour to visitors from other neighborhoods, proudly showing off the plants they had helped grow. Local newspapers began to take notice. A reporter from the Chicago Defender wrote a feature about the garden, highlighting how it was addressing food scarcity in the neighborhood. A photography student from the community college created an exhibit of striking black and white images showing garden moments. Gloria teaching a young mother about medicinal herbs. Mr. Washington building a trellis for climbing beans. Marcus carefully tending seedlings. Through it all, they worked on their application for historical status, gathering old photos of the factory, collecting stories from elders who had worked there or remembered the labor meetings. They documented how the garden was continuing the site's legacy as a community gathering place and economic resource. But Albert Coleman was not idle. One evening in late August, as they were cleaning up after a community dinner in the garden, a city worker appeared with an official notice. "Final approval has been granted for the sale," the worker said uncomfortably, handing the paper to Gloria. "Coleman Development will take possession in 2 weeks. All personal property must be removed by then. The news spread quickly through the group. Some wept openly, others argued about what to do next. In the chaos, no one noticed Marcus slip away. The boy ran through the twilit streets to the address printed on the business card Coleman had given him months earlier. It was a sleek downtown office building, its windows glowing gold against the darkening sky. Marcus hesitated only briefly before pushing through the revolving door. The security guard at the desk looked up in surprise. "Can I help you, son?" "I need to see Mr. Coleman," Marcus said firmly. "It's about the garden." "Mr. Coleman doesn't see people without appointments," the guard began, but he was interrupted by a voice from the elevators. "It's all right, Jim. I'll speak with him." Albert Coleman himself stood there, briefcase in hand, apparently on his way out for the evening. He gestured for Marcus to follow him back to the elevators. They rode in silence to the top floor, where Coleman led Marcus to a large corner office with windows overlooking the city. Chicago spread out below them, a sea of lights stretching to the horizon. Coleman set down his briefcase and took a seat behind his massive desk, motioning for Marcus to sit opposite. "You're a determined young man," Coleman observed, "coming all this way alone." "You're taking our garden," Marcus said bluntly. Coleman leaned back in his chair. "I'm developing underutilized property to create economic growth. It's business." "It's our food," Marcus countered, "and our neighborhood. People need that garden. People need jobs and decent housing too," Coleman replied. "My development will provide both." "Not for us," Marcus said. "The people who live there now won't be able to afford your fancy apartments. We'll all have to leave." Coleman's expression flickered just for a moment. "That's how progress works, son. Areas change, improve. Property values rise." "Why does progress have to push people out?" Marcus demanded. "Why can't it include us?" Coleman didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked to a credenza where a framed photograph stood. He picked it up and brought it to Marcus. The photo showed a much younger Coleman standing in front of a small grocery store. His arm was around an older man who shared his features. "That was my father's store," Coleman said quietly, "on 47th Street. He built it from nothing after coming north during the Great Migration. I worked there every day after school, just like you work in your garden." He set the photo down on the desk between them. "When I was 12, the city decided to build a highway. They used eminent domain to take our store and 24 other black-owned businesses. They called it Progress 2. Marcus looked up at Coleman in surprise. "So you know how it feels. Why would you do the same thing to us?" Coleman's jaw tightened. "I learned how the world works. If you don't own the land, you have no security. My father never recovered from losing that store. I swore I'd never be in that position again." "But now you're putting other people in that position," Marcus said softly. Coleman looked out the window, silent for a long moment. "It's not personal, Marcus, it's business." "It feels personal when it's your home," Marcus replied. "My grandma says a neighborhood isn't just buildings. It's people who care about each other." Coleman turned back to him. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She is," Marcus nodded. "She also says people can change, can be better if they remember where they came from." Coleman studied the boy for a long moment. "It's late. I'll have my driver take you home." As they rode in the luxurious car through the darkening city, neither spoke. When they reached Marcus's apartment building, Coleman finally broke the silence. "You've given me something to think about, Marcus Johnson. That's more than most people manage to do." Marcus nodded solemnly. "Please don't take our garden, Mr. Coleman." The next morning, Gloria found Marcus sitting on their small balcony, staring out at the neighborhood. "You disappeared last night," she said, concern in her voice. "Mrs. Patterson said you ran off after we got the notice." Marcus told her about his visit to Coleman's office. Gloria listened with growing alarm. "Marcus, you can't just run off downtown by yourself, and confronting Mr. Coleman like that. He told me about his dad's store," Marcus interrupted. "About how the city took it for a highway. I think he understood, Grandma, at least a little." Gloria sighed, sitting beside him. "Understanding doesn't always change things, baby, but you have a brave heart just like your daddy did." They spent the day at the garden with other community members, harvesting what they could and making plans to salvage plants and seedlings. The mood was somber but determined. This might be the end of their garden, but not of their community. As evening approached, the distant rumble of machinery caught their attention. Coming down the street was a bulldozer, followed by several trucks. Albert Coleman's black Mercedes brought up the rear. "They're not supposed to start for 2 more days," Mrs. Patterson cried. The small group watched in dismay as the vehicles pulled up to the garden's edge. Coleman emerged from his car, along with several men in construction hats and business suits. Gloria stepped forward, her back straight and proud. "Mr. Coleman, we were told we had until Friday to clear our things." "Plans change, Mrs. Johnson," Coleman replied. My investors are eager to break ground. He gestured to the men beside him. These gentlemen are from the city planning office and my construction firm. They're here to oversee the initial clearing. Marcus pushed past his grandmother to stand before Coleman. You can't do this, you know it's wrong. Coleman looked down at the boy, his expression unreadable. Move aside, Marcus, business is business. But Marcus didn't move. Instead, he planted his feet firmly at the garden's edge. No. Gloria stepped up beside her grandson, placing her hand on his shoulder. If you want this garden, Mr. Coleman, you'll have to go through us first. One by one, others joined them, Mrs. Patterson with her walker, Mr. Washington still in his postal uniform, Principal Hayes, and dozens more, forming a human chain around the garden. The bulldozers rumbled forward, their metal tracks crushing the wildflowers that had somehow managed to grow at the edges of the vacant lot. Marcus stood firm, his small frame seemingly no match for the massive yellow machines. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and tears streamed down his dark cheeks. You can't take our garden, Marcus shouted, his voice cracking. People need this food, my grandma needs her medicine plants. The construction foreman stepped forward, waving a sheaf of papers. Kid, I'm sorry, but this lot has been sold. The development starts today. Now please move before someone gets hurt. Coleman looked at the crowd, at the garden with its carefully tended rows of vegetables and herbs, and then at Marcus. For a moment, something flickered across his face, recognition, perhaps, or memory. The bulldozer inched forward again. Marcus didn't move. Behind him, Gloria called out in fear. Stop! Coleman suddenly commanded. The bulldozer fell silent. For a long moment, Coleman stood motionless, looking at the garden, at the determined faces of the community members. Then, to everyone's surprise, he walked over to Marcus and knelt down so they were eye to eye. You remind me of someone, Marcus Johnson, he said quietly. A boy who once believed the world could be fair if people just tried hard enough. Marcus met his gaze steadily. It can be if people remember what's important. Coleman glanced past him at the garden, the neat rows of vegetables, the herb section where Gloria worked her quiet magic, the flowers that brought color and beauty to a neighborhood that had too little of both. He rose and turned to the officials from the city planning office. Gentlemen, I'd like to propose a modification to our development plan. The next hour was a flurry of discussions, with Coleman sketching ideas on the back of blueprints, city officials making calls, and the community members watching in cautious hope. Finally, Coleman addressed the gathered crowd. Coleman Development will proceed with building on most of the purchased blocks, he announced. But this garden plot will remain as a permanent community space, with legal protections so it can never be developed. A murmur of disbelief ran through the crowd. Furthermore, Coleman continued, we will establish a community trust fund to support the garden's maintenance and expansion, and will work with the city to include truly affordable housing units in our development, with priority given to current neighborhood residents. Gloria stepped forward. Why the change of heart, Mr. Coleman? Coleman looked at Marcus, then back at Gloria. Let's just say I was reminded of who I wanted to be before I learned how the world works, and maybe the world works the way we make it work. He extended his hand to Gloria. I'd like to learn more about those medicinal herbs of yours, Mrs. Johnson. My mother used to grow something similar. As the two talked, the tension in the crowd eased. The bulldozers and trucks pulled away, leaving the garden intact. People began to celebrate, embracing each other with tears and laughter. Marcus sat on the garden bench his grandfather had made, watching as Coleman spoke with various community members, actually listening to their concerns and ideas. Mr. Washington clapped him on the shoulder as he passed. You did it, Marcus, he said. You saved our garden. Marcus shook his head. We all did it together. In the weeks and months that followed, Coleman proved true to his word. Construction began on the surrounding blocks, but the garden remained untouched. In fact, it expanded, with Coleman's company providing resources for a small greenhouse where they could extend the growing season, and a rainwater collection system to reduce dependence on city water. Coleman himself became a regular visitor, often bringing his own children to learn from Gloria about the herbs and vegetables. Slowly, the wariness between him and the community began to fade, replaced by a cautious partnership. The neighborhood changed. Yes, new buildings rose, new people moved in. But unlike other gentrified areas, the original residents remained, protected by the housing agreements Coleman had established. The garden served as common ground where old and new neighbors could meet and learn from each other. On a warm evening the following summer, the community gathered in the garden for their annual harvest festival. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes made from garden produce, children ran playing between the rows of plants, and music filled the air. Gloria and Marcus sat together on their bench, watching the celebration. "You did something amazing, child," Gloria said softly. "You reminded a man of his better self." Marcus leaned against his grandmother's shoulder. "I just didn't want to lose our garden." "Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest beginnings," Gloria replied. "Just like these plants, they start as tiny seeds, but look what they become when they're nurtured." As if on cue, Albert Coleman approached, carrying 2 plates of food. He handed one to Gloria and one to Marcus before sitting beside them. "Quite a transformation," he said, looking around at the thriving garden and the diverse crowd enjoying the evening. "The garden?" Gloria asked. Coleman shook his head slightly. "All of us." Marcus looked between his grandmother and the developer who had nearly destroyed their garden but had instead become its champion. He thought about the journey of the past year, from vacant lot to threatened garden to community cornerstone. "Mrs. Patterson says gardens are like people," he offered. "They need the right conditions to grow, but once they take root, they can weather almost anything." Coleman nodded thoughtfully. "Wise woman, Mrs. Patterson." As the evening deepened into night, lanterns were lit throughout the garden, casting a warm glow over the gathered community. Old and young, long-time residents and newcomers, they shared food and stories under the stars. In one corner, Gloria led a small group in singing old spirituals, her voice strong and clear despite her years. In another, children played hide-and-seek among the tall corn stalks. And in the center, a makeshift dance floor had formed where couples swayed to music from a portable record player, the sounds of Motown classics floating on the summer air. Marcus wandered through it all, taking in the sights and sounds of the community his small idea had helped strengthen. When he reached the garden's edge, he looked out at the neighborhood beyond. New buildings stood alongside the old, their lights twinkling in the darkness. But the heart of the neighborhood, the people and their connections to each other, remained intact. A small hand slipped into his, and he turned to find Sofia Rodriguez, the 7-year-old from next door who had become his faithful garden assistant. "Is it true what my mama says?" she asked. "That you saved the whole neighborhood with this garden?" Marcus shook his head, smiling. "Not me, all of us together, and the garden's just the beginning." "Can I help with the beginning too?" Sofia asked earnestly. "You already are," Marcus assured her. "That's how neighborhoods work. Everyone has a part to play." He looked back at the celebration, at Gloria and Mrs. Patterson laughing together, at Mr. Washington teaching some new residents about proper composting techniques, at Coleman deep in conversation with Principal Hayes about after-school programs for the garden. A year ago, none of this would have seemed possible. A vacant lot, a child's idea, an unlikely alliance. These small seeds had grown into something that was changing lives throughout the neighborhood. As Marcus and Sofia rejoined the festivities, Gloria caught her grandson's eye and smiled proudly. In that moment, Marcus understood what his grandmother had always told him. Real change didn't always come from grand gestures or important people. Sometimes it grew from the smallest beginnings, a child's determination, an elder's wisdom, a community's courage to stand together. And like the garden itself, once those roots took hold, there was no telling how far they might spread or what new life they might bring forth. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.